Video, you're watching the second lesson on percents. In this lesson, we'll be talking about and reviewing the way to convert percentages into fractions and decimals. You can see on the first page, on this first slide, that you can turn 30% into 3 out of 10, or 3 over 10, into a decimal, 0.3. Right? To go from a fraction to a percent, you can convert to a decimal first, right? And that's what I like to do. But there are ways to turn it this way, but I'm going to do it my preferred way. If you have your own way, you're more than welcome to do it. Just show me your work on tests and assignments, and if it works, it's great. So, review. How can we find the probability of any outcome? This is back to our very first unit. So hopefully you remember this because I'm asking this now. Well, to find the probability of any outcome, you need the outcomes you want, what you're looking for, over the total number of outcomes, the total number of things that are happening, or that could happen, right? So again, in an example here, flipping a coin and getting heads has what probability? Well, the outcomes we want heads. We're getting heads. Well, the total number of outcomes is 2. You can get heads or tails, right? And the outcomes we want is heads. So there's only one outcome we want out of a total of 2 outcomes. So one outcome we want, a total of 2. 1 over 2. Well, that's 1/2. And that's it. That's basically probability reviewed really quickly. So when we do that, when we go, okay, outcomes we want over total outcomes, we end up with a fraction. 1 over 2. How can we give this answer in a different form? Again, this is a review from our very first unit. Well, percentages are closely linked to fractions and decimals. They can be used basically interchangeably. Changing from one to another requires certain steps, right? So we know that 1 over 2 is the same as 50% and is the same as 0.5. And so we're going to talk about how to change 1 over 2 that we saw here into 50% and into 0.5. Now, most of you probably already know from at the back of your hand, it's easy at the back of your hand, that 1/2 is 50%, but you may not necessarily know how to or why 1/2 turns into 50%. So, when we are changing fractions, percents, or decimals to any of the other two, we need to use this rule, right? Percents can turn into decimals and decimals into fractions. Percents let us turn fractions into decimals and decimals into fractions. So that's why we have percents for the most part as well, because it's an easy way to show proportion, but it also allows us to bridge fractions and decimals. It allows us to turn fractions into decimals relatively easily too. So know that to turn a fraction into a decimal, you would need to turn it into, let me just clear the ink, you would need to turn it into a percent first, then a decimal. And in using these two steps, it makes it a bit easier. And to turn a decimal into a fraction, well, you turn it into a percent and then into a fraction. And you'll see why it's easier. So, percents to decimal, this is very easy. Any percent, any at all, can be turned into a decimal by moving that decimal, that little dot, 2 spots to the left. So here we have 50%. Now you may be asking yourself, well, where's my decimal? Well, when you write any number like 2 or 8 or 25, you don't write the decimal because there's no need to, but it's there. It's just invisible, right? 2 is the same as saying 2.0. 8 is the same as saying 8.0. 25 is the same as saying 25.0. But mathematicians are lazy, and they're just going to not write the 0 because they don't need to, because there's no number after the 8. There's no number after the 2, and there's no number after the 25. But it's there. So you pretend that the decimal is there, and you go, okay, well, to turn a percent into a decimal, I take the decimal and I go shift 1, shift 2. I move it 2 spots. So if I moved it 1 spot, that would be 5.0, but I'm not done there. I have to move it over again. And that makes it here. And now we have a decimal here. Well, if you have a decimal here, you have 0.50, or in other words, 0.5. Right? And again, I removed that 0, but you could keep it there if you wanted, right? So you just moved the decimal 2 spots to the left. You move the decimal 2 spots to the left, right? So the reason why this works and the reason why you can just move a decimal over is because when you're turning a percent into a decimal, all you're doing is dividing by 100, right? If I take the number, let's pick 25. No, not 25. Let's pick 15. 15%, right? And I'm turning that into a decimal. Well, I'm basically just going dividing by 100. And I've shown you in class before, when you divide by numbers that have following zeros like this, like 10, 100, 1,000, you count the number of zeros, and you move the decimal space that many times. So I have 2 zeros, so I move the decimal space 1, 2 spots. And so 15% is the same as saying 0.15. And that's it. So decimals to percent. So let's say we do the opposite. So we went from percent to decimal. Now we're turning decimal into percent. Well, it's also very easy. Well, we turned a percent into a decimal by moving the dot 2 spaces to the left, right? Because that's the same as dividing it by 100. Well, you're doing the opposite, so you move the decimal spaces the opposite direction. So instead of 2 spots to the left, you're moving the decimal spot 2 spots to the right. For example, we have 0.25, okay? So if I'm turning it into a percent, I take the decimal and I go, all right, 1, well that's 2.5, but I'm moving it 2 spots, 2, which makes it 25%, right? And again, let's go back to our 15% example. We have 0.15, and we're trying to turn it into a percent. Well, previously, when we were moving the decimal over this way, in this case, we were dividing by 100. But now we're doing the opposite, so the opposite is now multiplying by 100. When you multiply by 100, you do the exact same thing before. You count the number of zeros, but instead of moving to the left, you move to the right. So 0.15 is 15%. And that's it. That's really easy. So when you look at this rule, going percent to decimal and decimal to percent, super easy. You either move the decimal over to the right if you're turning it into a decimal, if you're turning a percent into a decimal, and if you're turning a decimal into a percent, you move the decimal to the right. Right? So I just want to reiterate this. To turn a percent into a decimal, you move the decimal 2 spots to the left. To turn a decimal into a percent, you move the decimal 2 spots to the right. Numbers greater than 1 with a decimal, right? What happens when you have a number with a decimal that's larger than 1? For example, you have 3.45. Well, how do I turn 3.45 into a percent? Well, you do the exact same thing, right? You take the decimal, and I'm turning this number into a percent, 1, 2, right? Move it 2 spots, so it goes 3.45, 3.4, 334.5 to 345%, right? I moved the decimal 2 spots, so now the decimal is here. So the decimal is now here, so I have 345%. Each whole number is 100%. So if I have the decimal 1.0, and I wanted to turn 1 into a percent, well, I move the decimal over 1 spot and another spot. And I put that 0 there because that's what's there. There's nothing there, so it's a 0. So that's 100%. Each whole number represents 100%. So if you see a number or a decimal number with a whole number in it, you don't have to worry about it. You just go 1, 2. Now it's a percent. You have over 100%, and in this case, 345%. So try and convert each of these percents or decimals into the other. So either convert a decimal into a percent or a percent into a decimal. Okay, so I'm going to move on from there. Hopefully you pause the video, if you haven't, do now, and try and solve these. But right now I'm going to move on to fractions and percent. To turn a percent into a fraction, we already need to understand that a percent is always, 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 always out of 100, right? So when we say 50%, we can automatically turn that into a fraction. It's 50 out of 100. There's not even math involved. You just know it's 50 out of 100. 24% is the same as saying 24 out of 100. They're basically fractions already, but they need to be simplified. So if I asked you a question, well, what's 50% as a fraction? If you said 50 out of 100, at best I'd give you half marks because you need to turn 50 out of 100 into a simplified fraction. So we have 50 out of 100, right? Well, we already know this from previous studies that 50 is half of 100, so we could just convert that into 1/2, right? Let's say we didn't know. Let's say we didn't pay attention in math class previously. Well, you're paying attention now. And instead, we can just go, okay, well, let's simplify. We can divide top and bottom by 2. So that'll simplify it, right? Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. Divided by 2, 25, right? Over 50, right? Well, I can keep going. I can divide both by 5. So I can keep going. So that would be 5 over 10. I can still keep going, right? I can divide both by 5 again, which would make it 1/2. And so we've simplified into the smallest form. And so if you didn't already know 50 out of 100 is 1/2, you can just divide the fraction that the top and bottom can both be divided by, right? I can divide 50 and 100 by 5. So I just, by 2. Sorry, not by 5. I could do by 5, but I divide it by 2. I get 25 over 50. And then I can divide this by 5 to get 5 over 10, because I can divide the top and bottom by 5. I can divide the top and bottom by by 5 again to get 1/2. And so you can just do these steps to get the simplest answer. You don't have to get it right away. You can just do it this way. So don't rush and take your time. So 40% of students love math. How can we turn this into a fraction? Remember, a percent is out of 100. So 40% is 40 out of 100. Well, which is 40 out of 100? Are we done? No, we need to simplify. 40 out of 100 is 2/5. So you could even say that 40%, because these two are the same, 40% is the same as 2/5, right? So I know 40% is the same as saying 40 out of 100. And so you write the fraction 40 out of 100, right? Like this. And then you simplify into 2/5. However you want to simplify it. If you already know 40 out of 100 is 2/5, fine. If you need to take an extra step or two, show me that. Then, now that you know 40 out of 100 is 2/5, you can also say that 40% is the same as saying 2/5. So that's the fraction I'd be looking for. I wouldn't be looking for this one, right? I want the simplest answer. Fractions to percent. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. Before, it was very easy, right? We looked back, turning a percent into a decimal, well, you move the dot or the decimal 2 spots to the left. Turning a decimal into a percent, you move the decimal 2 spots to the right. And with turning percents into fractions, well, percents are basically already fractions, right? You just go, it's out of 100, so 50% is 50 out of 100. And then you simplify. But turning a fraction into a percent is a little bit tricky, right? Percents are always out of 100, right? All percents are always out of 100, but not all fractions are out of 100, right? So 36 out of 100 is 36% because it's out of 100, so it's 36. Easy. But what about 36/45? What about this? What about this? Well, you could do the fish trick. The same trick I showed you for proportional reasoning, right? So if I have 36 out of 45 and I'm turning it into a percent, well, I can just write down 36 out of 45. That's what we know. Well, what else do we know? We're trying to turn this into a percent. So is there another spot I could fill this in? Well, we know percents are always out of 100, right? So that must mean this one, if I'm turning 36 out of 45 into a percent, then I must turn this fraction into something out of 100. And so now I'm looking for this. So now that we have this, we use the fish trick. So you start on the opposite side of what you're looking for. We're looking for this. You start here and you go multiply, multiply, then divide to get your answer. Right? You multiply, then divide. A common mistake that happens with this trick is you go divide, then multiply. No, multiply, then divide to get your answer. Multiply, then divide to get your answer. So when we do this, we go 36, multiply by 100 to get us 3,600, right? Then we divide by 45, right? So we divide by 45 to get our answer, which is 80. So now we know that 36 out of 45 is the same as saying 80% or 80 out of 100. Or you could even take it a step further and say it's the same as saying 0.8. Now you've turned a fraction into a percent into a decimal. So these methods aren't too hard. You just need to know how to do them and practice them. So practice turning these fractions into percentages. And we'll just move on from there. And so that's basically it. We've converted percents into fractions, fractions into percents, decimals into percents, and so on. Now you may be saying, well, how can we turn decimals into fractions? Well, you just do that. You go decimal to percent, percent into fraction to percent, percent into decimal, just like I did with our example here. I turn this fraction into a percent, and if I have 80% and I'm turning it into a decimal, I go 1, 2, boom, 0.8. So your percent is your nice middleman. It'll change your percents into fractions. You can change your percents into decimals. And so you don't have to go directly from fraction to decimal. So try these practice questions, and yeah, I'll see you next lesson.